Welcome everyone to today's roundtable on migration futures and transnationalism scholarship. My name is Francis Collins. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Waikato in the city of Hamilton in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is my pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate and participate in this roundtable, not only for the excellent speakers that are participating in the fascinating discussion that we will have, but also since this event is part of the 20th anniversary of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. For me, it is 14 years ago this month, actually, that I went to ARI as a somewhat bright-eyed and probably rather naive postdoctoral fellow. And I can say after 2 years at ARI and another 3 in other parts of NUS and many more since in collaboration with ARI researchers, I'm pretty confident that my experiences, relationships and opportunities developed at ARI have been career-making and have expanded the way in which I work on and I think about migration and indeed research more generally. So while I've got the privilege to have the floor here, I just want to thank you all who make ARI such a special and successful place, not least Professor Brenda Yeoh, who has supported my work in so many ways over the last decade and a half. Today, though, we're focused on transnationalism and migration futures. The idea for this roundtable and the speakers involved emerged from a forthcoming Handbook of Transnationalism that Brenda and I have co-edited over the last year and a half and will be published by Edward Elgar in early 2022. The handbook includes some 27 chapters by 36 authors based in 14 countries across Asia, Australasia, Europe, and North America. The chapters in the book span discussions of the conceptualization of transnationalism, of different types and expressions of transnationalism, transnational migration specifically, and lastly, transnational networks and circulations. Now, as a marker for people-led cross-border connections and activities, particularly those associated with migration, transnationalism has been one of the standout academic and practical terms of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It was actually a term that was rarely used in academic publications in the social sciences, even on migration, even up until the early 1990s, but literally features now in thousands of publications per year. Sometimes, yes, only as a byword for international or a nomenclature for particular types of people or organizations, but also often examined as a specific set of phenomena that entail crossing and reworking of relations across national borders. Transnationalism is a term that emphasizes the transversal character of global social life, while never losing sight of the structuring force of nation states and the efficacy of border control and regulation. Now, if we were carrying out this roundtable at the end of 2019, it might well be commented that transnationalism, and indeed the extent of migrant-led transnationalism in particular, was perhaps even somewhat passé. That would probably be unfair, but it would be thought that it might be expected, and that transnationalism was a clear result of the technological, political, economic, social, and cultural processes that are sometimes gathered under the term globalisation. To speak of transnationalism and migration in 2021, however, seems rather different. When physically crossing borders has become very difficult, international travel has been massively reduced, and governments around the world are considering reworking approaches to migration and mobility that had seemed commonsensical in recent decades. The purported age of migration that had supposedly fueled globe-spanning transnational lives, activities, and organizations is, for some researchers, coming to an end. It is to this particular conundrum that we seek to turn our attention to in this roundtable. We have come to see transnationalism as a consistent, if always shifting, feature of social life. Yet the global COVID-19 pandemic has upended our lives globally and had wide-ranging consequences for many taken for granted sociological phenomenon, not least migration and transnationalism. In finalizing the Handbook of Transnationalism, Brenda and I spent some time reflecting on this problematic. The pandemic made us all intensely aware of how inextricably interconnected our fates and fortunes are in these complex and highly changeable times. The handbook is, in the end, interestingly, a testament to both the fragility and the enduring strength of transnationalism as a world-spanning idea, as well as an everyday human practice. Indeed, we are, as intellectuals, connected in a transnational manner, and of course we are here too today. Even prior to the pandemic, scholars of transnationalism and migration have paid significant attention to immobility, how it is produced in varying social structures, especially border controls, as well as how transnational connectivity emerges and is sustained not just in spite of, but exactly because of such immobility regimes. We observe that while the pandemic has interrupted migration and other movements, pre-existing transnational ties, networks, and circulations of all kinds have not only maintained their significance, but in many instances become even more pervasive. We are living and working such connections and practices right now in this very roundtable, organized across geographies and linked by our professional and personal transnationalism. The pandemic is also cause to reconsider how migration and transnational life have been arranged, and in particular highlights the importance of a greater focus on social justice and inclusion in the lives of migrants and other people whose lives stretch across borders. Questioning in particular, perhaps, the reliance on transnational regimes of temporary migration that marginalize the rights and indeed the health of millions of migrants and others around the world. Which brings me to the challenge of this roundtable. Today here, we have 4 esteemed authors of chapters from the Handbook of Transnationalism. We have tasked each with reflecting on the key insights of transnationalism that have emerged from their contribution to the handbook. Subsequently, we've asked them to consider how the links between migration and transnationalism will evolve in a post-pandemic world. And finally, we have asked each author to consider the next step for theorizing transnationalism. Where does this field of research go next? How do we understand the relationship between migration and transnationalism in a time beyond the pandemic, at the point in which that comes, or through the pandemic? Our discussion is organized in 3 parts around these questions. So in a moment, I'll finish by introducing each speaker very briefly and then handing over that to them to discuss for about 5 minutes the key insights into their chapter, before opening up for a wider discussion of transnationalism and the pandemic. And finally, in the last segment, we will return to the future of transnationalism research with a 5-minute reflection from each panelist. For the discussion of the relationship between transnationalism and migration futures, I do encourage you all to please offer your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will ask the speakers to address these where relevant. And if possible, we may ask people to ask the question themselves, so we'll see what that looks like in terms of the volume of comments and questions. So to introduce our panelists, firstly, we've got Professor Zhang Biao, Director of Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. Professor Zhang's research addresses various types of migration, internal and international, unskilled and highly skilled, immigration and return migration, and the places and people left behind in China, India, and other parts of Asia. His chapter in the handbook explores the multi-scalarity of transnationalism, raising questions about what, when, and how transnationalism matters. We also have Dr. Jolina Sinanan and Professor Heather Horst, authors of a chapter on communication technologies and transnational networks in the handbook. Dr. Sinanan is a research fellow in digital media and ethnography at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on digital media practices in relation to regionally comparative mobilities, family relationships, work, and gender. She has contributed ethnographic studies on Nepal, Trinidad, Australia, and Cambodia. Professor Horst is the director of the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. She researches material culture and the mediation of social relations through digital media and technology, with a regional focus that includes Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Jamaica. And Professor Valentino Mazzucato is Professor of Globalisation and Development, Maastricht University, the Netherlands. And she heads the Globalisation, Transnationalism and Development Research Program. She leads international research on transnational families that live between Africa and Europe. Professor Mazzucato's contribution to the handbook, co-authored with Joan Van Giel, addresses transnational young people and the experience of growing up and being active in a transnational field. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome all of these 4 speakers to the roundtable today. So I'm looking forward to hearing from each of these speakers and to the roundtable discussion that will follow. Now I hand over firstly to Professor Zhang Biao to start the discussion.
So I think in my chapter, I just wish to caution against what I call methodological transnationalism. Methodological transnationalism is the assumption that the transnational connections must be somehow important and interesting, worth our attention, without asking why it matters. So this is really a mirror image of a methodological nationalism. As a very celebrated essay by Nina Schiller and Andrea Muller, I can't remember the name immediately. I think it's very well argued that the methodological nationalism does not necessarily mean that we take a nation state very seriously, but rather we take a nation state for granted without asking how nation state emerged. That is a question. I mean, if we pay full attention to the history of nation making, it can be completely nationally focused, but it would not be a case of methodological nationalism, because we see how nation state emerge as a historical process, and we can answer why it matters, right? So therefore the question why transnationalism matters is quite important for us, especially for scholars like us in the global South, which we not, we are not pioneers, we are not a mainstay in determining what is becoming fashionable in the English publishing industry. And we have to be aware, is this our business? Is this our worry? So I mean, related to this general question, there are two sub-questions that I raised. Number one, why in 1990s, transnational paradigm became popular in the English literature, especially in North America? And we all know, since the 1930s at least, Lenin has made very clear, capitalism cannot be understood nationally, right? And because capital has to export itself transnationally. And therefore we have colonialism, we have imperialism. And the entire paradigm of world system theory is to say that unless we understand the economy transnationally, we will not be able to understand anything inside of nation state. 1990s interest in transnationalism probably indicate a certain kind of hope that the people, ordinary people, can create something new from bottom through their transnational networks outside of the framework of nation state. And so therefore, of course, it is against the integration paradigm, assimilation paradigm specific to immigration issues in North America and to some extent in Australia and Europe. So then there we have a second sub-question. Then is this our problem for people in China, India, Malaysia? Of course, I mean, on one hand, it's quite, for Chinese scholars, it's a little strange. I mean, transnational, we talk about Huaqiao, Chinese diaspora, since the Qing dynasty. I mean, transnational networks were extremely important, without which there would be no Republican revolution. So there will be no modern China in a way. And the entire business of nation building, of socialist projects are almost by definition transnational processes, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a nation building unless it is a part of a global movement. So now suddenly, okay, we think there's such a thing as a transnational paradigm that we should jump into. And how is that related to our own history? Right, the 30 years, 40 years, a struggle of nation building and the socialist internationalism and etc. All these deep transnational practices somehow figure rather marginally in contemporary writing. So this, I mean, so there's this second, I mean, first question, why 1990s in North America, and the second question, why we? Why should we be? I mean, in what way we should engage that? And then this article tried to raise some suggestion about how we can develop a certain conceptual tools and empirical tools, tools for empirical investigation that can help us to figure out why transnationalism matter, at least to distinguish the transnational networks that matter and those that probably matter less, right? So I use the notion of scale and etc. But this doesn't matter too much. So if I can be a bit of what do you say, a bit tricky here, can I use this 1 minute to do a little advertisement? And there's a question, how we should have a migration studies that can speak to larger concerns? Because migration studies are very easy to be dissolved into case studies that just document what we see immediately, because the migrants' experience is somehow a bit unusual. The experience itself looks interesting and can be very emotionally touching, etc. We have a weaker tendency to scrutinize why it matters. So how to move forward from here? So we set up a so-called mobility lab in Max Planck for social anthropology. And now we have an inventory called the MoLab inventory, which we invite all the scholars like you to contribute short entries, just about 300 to 3,000 words, to document one case that indicate an emerging pattern of mobility, emerging pattern of transnational connections, and then raise new questions. By doing so, if we can accumulate these cases in different places, probably we can build a bigger picture. What we want to avoid is that we see one case and then immediately we jump to certain kind of general theorization. It's kind of jumpy theorization without really put all the cases together like bricks, one by one. Then we build something. Then we see the tangible, concrete connections between human experiences and something larger out there, right? And I will stop here. Then we very much look forward to listening to other speakers and also feedbacks on these questions. Thank you.
Great. I'll hand over to Dr. Julina Shinnan and Professor Heather Horst.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here. So Heather and I will speak briefly about what we have contributed to the Handbook of Transnationalism, which is predominantly a reflection on digital practice in migrant experiences. So what we have seen, but by reflecting on those digital practices from the diverse, that captures the diverse experience of migrants, is that what we've seen over the last year and a half is that the experience that might have been more typical of migrant families have now extended to wider populations due to pandemic restrictions and stay-at-home orders. So, for example, we've looked at digital visual communication as connected presence and digital togetherness, where I'm sure that many of us have now seen countless examples of the circulation of images of home projects, children and life stages that would have been celebrated as events with families and posted to either Facebook timelines or in group chats over platforms such as WhatsApp. Indeed, when Heather and I did a project, we're involved with a project on digital media practices in households in Australia some years back, almost all of the participants who used WhatsApp had family members overseas. The participants who had extended family all in Australia did not seem to use WhatsApp. However, we've seen these changes in the adoptions of different platforms and digital practices over the last year and a half, where the exchanging of well wishes, motivation, humorous, gentle check-ins with others has become more common. There's been an increase in group chats and perhaps the genres of communication and, of genres of images that have been circulated. Secondly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mariano and Miller's concept of polymedia environments. Of course, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more contributed case studies on polymedia in different settings. And again, what we've seen over the last year and a half, even though polymedia emphasizes a shift from cost and access to managing relationships, what we've seen more is this increase in how feeling at home has transformed due to pandemic circumstances. The emotional consequences of polymedia environments have again perhaps become more of a common experience due to the pandemic, where people are more cognizant of the emotional landscapes people might be experiencing while more time is spent at home. I'll throw it over to Heather for now.
Thanks, Jelena, and also just adding my gratitude for the opportunity both to be involved in the book, but also to contribute to the seminar. So what I would like to do is actually pick up on Jelena's discussion of digital visual communication. And I wanted to mention a few examples of the kinds of practices we're now really seeing expanding and even intensifying over the last 2 years. And this is, much more kind of ethnographic in scope, and I think will shape some of the discussions later on. So the first example I wanted to mention comes from some of the Jamaican families that I've worked with for really over the past 20 years. And this is an example of a woman that I knew, Mrs. Chung, who passed away this past year. And so with COVID-19 restrictions governing the timing of funerals, it was impossible for Mrs. Chung's funeral plans, which she had originally actually written down to say 90-minute program with music, sermons, a funeral gathering with food, with hundreds of people in the community there. It was just impossible for this kind of event to take place. It was also impossible for her eldest daughter, Janice, to fly from Miami to Jamaica for the funeral, which only now included, they were restricted to a kind of graveside service. So it was left to her other daughter, Sharon, to organize the casket, her mother's final outfit, the decisions about who the 10 guests who were allowed to attend the graveside ceremony should be, and so on. Janice did continue to send money, like she has for years, for funeral costs as well as flowers. And during the service, Sharon was very careful to document the sermon and the singing through video and photographs, which she later sent through WhatsApp to both her sister as well as her close friends and family. But her sister Janice was a bit disappointed that Sharon had decided not to live stream the funeral over Facebook. But the reason that Sharon did this is that she decided it would make the event, the funeral, really too public and might actually offend people she wasn't actually able to invite. Instead, she wanted to focus on her mother and her grief rather than the ire of friends and family who felt that they should have been asked to attend the funeral given Mrs. Chung's status in the broader community. A second example comes from my more recent work with in the Pacific with fashion designers, musicians, and others in the creative sector. As many people will recognize, COVID made it very difficult for family to travel between places like Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia. And it also impacted the country's tourism sector, which had significant economic implications. So for musicians, fashion designers, and so on, the reduction of opportunities to have live shows or gigs led many musicians in particular to turn to things like Zoom, Facebook Live, and spaces on Twitter to perform. And these live sessions have often been advertised as fundraising opportunities, both for the musicians who share their bank account details as well as mobile numbers for mobile money services, but it's also for fundraising for the broader community. So there are initiatives such as raising funds to help single mothers, raising funds to help cook food for people who didn't have access to food and so on. So rather than the tourists that might have usually been their kind of audience, most of the people donating were family and friends who lived overseas. And in fact, other local Fijians who weren't able to attend in person also joined these sessions. So these donation performances both brought money and kept the Fijian diaspora connected through these kind of shared cultural forums, the conversations and the sense of being there, as much as those who are normally in Fiji to attend these things. So in these two examples, which are very brief, I just wanted to give a sort of sense of how digital visual communication has really become part of the negotiation of these transnational relationships during the pandemic, and how these opportunities for both synchronous communication, care, as well as the kind of creation of intimacy continue to be adapted in this very changing landscape. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And just for the last 5-minute discussion of the insights they see around transnationalism, Professor Valentina Mazzucato.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to be giving a very short synopsis of the chapter that Yeoh and I wrote called Transnational Young People. And I just want to thank Francis and Brenda for having invited me to be part of this really exciting handbook, and also to this roundtable, because I find, especially the discussion that will come later on, I'm very curious to see what will come out of it. Transnational young people, how did we define them? Well, these are young people who are affected by migration, either their own or their parents, and who are multiply and simultaneously engaged with their or their parents' home country and their or their parents' country of residence. So going to Professor Xiaobiang's question, does it matter? We only look at those young people for who are indeed transnationally engaged. We don't presume that they will be transnationally engaged. But for those who are transnationally engaged, who are these young people? Well, we looked at young people who migrate themselves, either with an adult or alone. We looked at literatures that look at young people of the so-called second generation. So they didn't migrate themselves, but their parents did. And finally, we also look at young people who did not migrate, but whose parents did, but migrated without them. So they are the so-called left behind. So these are the three types of transnational young people that we looked at. We did not include literatures that look at young people who move for educational purposes, for example, such as the literatures on astronaut families or third culture kids or international student mobilities, which is separate chapters in the handbook. So that's just by premising who it is that we focused on. And we reviewed literatures on three types of literatures. I won't go into them because there's no time, but I want to then end with our sort of main conclusions from having reviewed these literatures. So we reviewed the second generation youth literatures, which very much asks, how do young people, for example, living in the United States, who are affected by their engagement with their parents' home country, how are they affected by it? And this literature really tends to focus on things like identity, sense of belonging, etc. Then we also looked at the left behind literature, which really tends to focus on how our children who stay behind when their parents migrate overseas, how are they affected in their well-being? And thirdly, we look at sort of more new and emerging literature that we call transnational youth mobility literature, which look at young people and this emerging field of inquiry that focuses on the actual mobility of young people. And this is the literature that we focus on as in our conclusions of sort of ways forward. So let me just briefly sort of summarize our main conclusions. First of all, the first two literatures, the ones on second generation young people in the countries where their parents migrated to, and the left behind literatures, ironically, even though they both use a transnational lens, they tend to have quite a sedentary view of young people. They tend to focus on them in terms of how their transnational engagements affect them in the residence country, that's for second generation. Or in the left behind, we tend to presume that the left behind, well, are just that, they're left behind, so they're not moving. But actually, young people engage in all sorts of mobility. I mean, think of the first and second generation migrants who, for example, visit their family back in a home country or engage in roots tourism. Or some even start businesses in their parents' home countries. And there are numerous cases or ethnographic studies on, for example, the being sent back to a parent's country of origin as a young person to be sort of educated. So that's for the first and second generation, how they're mobile, they're quite mobile and they engage in quite a lot of mobility. And on the other hand, the left behind also, actually, we have identified studies that do say, because of parental migration, these left behind are actually quite mobile internally to a country, because maybe they move from caregiver to caregiver. And finally, they themselves might migrate eventually, having certain migration aspirations, following in their parents' footsteps. So ironically, despite all of this mobility, the actual mobility of young people has not been a large area of research until the past couple of decades. The last literature, the one that looks at the actual mobility of young people, is literature that combines a transnational perspective with a mobility lens. So here again, I think we relate to the last point that Professor Zhang Biao mentioned about the mobility lab. I think this is a very fruitful way to engage with transnationalism and mobility, is bringing these together. And the studies, the emerging studies that we reviewed in this chapter really talk about how trips made by young people to either their or their parents' home countries, how this allows them to maintain transnational relationships with family members and friends, or how these allow them to gain motivation in their own educational trajectories, or build resilience and acquire educational experiences, all of which lead to their development of themselves as adults. So during such visits, young people rekindle ties with former caregivers or significant others. They regain motivation to do their best in school and undertake excursions to historical sites that instill pride in their heritage. So there seems to be quite a lot of effects that such home visits can take. So I think I'm really happy that I'm speaking together with Heather Horst and Jolina Sinanan, sorry, Jolina, because I'm very much for this chapter, instead of the ICT and all of the, let's say, ways of remaining connected in a not necessarily physically mobile way, we really focus on the physicality of mobility and what the embodied experiences of travel actually mean and do with these young people's lives. So I have some directions for future research, but I see that I've been talking for quite some time. So maybe I will just keep those directions for future research as part of the contribution to the conversation that is to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentina, and thank you to all of you for those short introductions to the general question of transnationalism and how you've approached that. We're now moving on to a question to think about specifically, and I know that Heather and Jolina have already addressed this to a degree, about how the links between migration and transnationalism will evolve in a pandemic and indeed post-pandemic world. It's kind of cliche to say that the global pandemic has wide-ranging destructive effects on lots of different social phenomena. It does. Migration and mobility, perhaps particularly. But some of the points that that Yeoh was raising earlier about the historical precedents of particular phenomena, transnationalism, or the extent to which our responses to the restrictions that are associated with COVID as being something that might be influenced particularly by ideas emerging within the English-speaking world, makes questions about how much we see this particular moment as being that pivotal. So what we wanted to do in this little section here, this little dialogue, is to ask the panelists, but also to ask our audience here to raise questions in relation to what they see the post-pandemic world and what does it mean for not just migration, not just moving across borders. We've had discussions of that and some interesting discussions of that, but also to transnationalism, to this notion of connecting across borders, which is deeply historical, as Yeoh has mentioned, but also is enacted in very particular ways through particular technologies, as Heather and Jolina have mentioned, and of course, as Valentina has said, relates to particular generations and their experiences of being mobile or being connected to people who are mobile. Now, there are a couple of some general questions in the chat box here. The questions about whether we are actually in the end of the age of migration or whether methodological nationalism is inherently flawed. I'll leave those there for the time being, but I might just see if I can turn firstly maybe to you, Yeoh, given that you have raised the questions of the novelty of transnationalism, whether you might also speak to how you see that within a context of a pandemic and post-pandemic world.
I'm not fully prepared for that, but may I just respond by pointing to 2 points. Number one, transnationalism is a very much a territorial way of thinking. You have a nation state, the nation state as a spatial container, and therefore, I mean, in response to that or opposing that, you have a transnational space. And what we see during pandemic is that there is emerging importance of logistical logic. which works with and sometimes against territorial logic. And we just had a video conversation on this topic with Severa in National University of an Australian National University about the territorial and the logistical. Territorial is basically to anchor people to certain space, so therefore border control and etc. And the logistical is to follow the flow. You use, contact tracing apps. You let them flow, but you monitor it, you follow it, you condition it, right? So logistic is all about your termability in a particular shape. So therefore, I mean, if you look at the spatial terms, it is a transnational, but the question is that what is the logic, what's the driving force? It's no longer, what matters is not the space itself, but it's rather whether or not you can follow the flow. So it's a time, space all come together. That's the point one. Point two, whether or not the transnationalism will become less important. I mean, now here we just use the term as a descriptive term. It's very difficult to say. I would just suggest that it will remain a very important lens for our understanding about the world change, but the shape will change. I assume it will be becoming more structured transnationalism. I just think of China as an example. I mean, that's a very complex, there's lots of politics going on, but the transnational capital flow in and out of China is definitely curtailed. It has been reduced quite significantly during the COVID. Actually the government used the COVID as a moment to do that. But can you say that, okay, China is less transnational? No. So one road, one belt. The China's connection with the Central Asia, with South Asia, and then now Afghanistan, which is a very strategic new transnational world building project. So that part will become more important. So, so then even spatially, you have a shift from the Pacific. Atlantic was an Atlantic crossing. Probably that was most the early colonial time. It was the defining space for world making. And then you have the Pacific, cross the Pacific, right? And now probably it is the Eurasia, the landmass. The connection there will become more important. And Atlantic now also became a bit more important again, but in a different way. It's more about a NATO military relation rather than really a societal people-to-people connection, because across Atlantic that was always important. What new is that actually the coming back of NATO and etc. So in the future, I think this big picture is important, and then it's definitely will be very interesting to investigate how that affects people's behavior and perception, right? And how Muslim population in China perceive Afghanistan. How do they make sense of Taliban? And relation between Turkey and Xinjiang and etc. It all became, I think, a topic worth investigating.
Thanks, Yeoh. Can I invite some of our other panelists, whether you have any comments on that specific question about the implications of the post-pandemic or the pandemic world for transnationalism?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question, one that none of us can exactly answer because it asks us to see into the future. And if there's anything that this pandemic has shown us is that we're very bad at seeing into the future. But maybe just starting from where I left off about, the importance. So one thing is that our work looking at transnational families between Africa and Europe has actually pointed out that yes, ICTs, all sorts of new media enable people to have these transnational relationships, but especially when dealing with children and adult relationships, that this seems to be working better when you have some face-to-face contact every once in a while, so that a trip is allowed, is possible. And you do see that young people, both of the first generation as well as of the second generation. In fact, we did a large-scale survey of young people with a migrant background in 3 European countries, and found that second generation migrant youth, which is a term that we don't like to use, but we need to use because we need to engage with the literature, they actually travel back to their parents' home country much more and very frequently than first generation. So what I want to say is that because we find that these trips do have very important meanings, and also in terms of the development of these young people, these trips often give them the types of resources that they need to overcome some of the discriminatory environments that they face in Europe. What I think is necessary for us to think about is, if we are thinking of a post-pandemic world in which maybe travel becomes less the norm, and here I would actually like to bring in all of climate change as well, not just the post-pandemic world, but you do see that there are increasing pressures on, for example, airline companies to raise their fees. You see also that governments and even universities, for example, my university, we cannot now take a plane, but we have to take, within 8 hours travel, we have to take a train. And I think this will increase and make travel maybe more expensive. So then I think what's important to ask is, what are these young people losing by if they're not going to be able to travel back to their home countries? What kinds of new inequalities might be created due to less ability to engage with a home country? Of course, I'm very happy, to hear also what Jolina and Heather have to say, because of course their research has a lot to do with the let's say also a non-mobile way of being transnationally engaged, non-physically mobile, although it can also entail physical mobility. But I do think that's really important for us to continue to engage in, and this transnational perspective combined with the mobility perspective is, I think, a way for us to investigate these kinds of questions.
So I'll jump in and say, one of the things that I'm finding really interesting about these discussions is that I can't really come to this question without actually thinking reflexively about the fact that I am in Australia, one of 2 countries in the world where the borders are completely and utterly closed. And there's been some really so I think that, I think we sort of see 2 things happening. One, I think, and I can see this also in Fiji, but I think in Australia, I think there is more empathy with the kind of inability to actually, see family, the kind of sense of distancing, that sort of thing, that sense that transnational migrants often have, and also the kind of desire to find new ways to connect. 30% of Australians, just the broader Australian population, are born overseas, and about half the people have connections that are kind of abroad. So we have all sorts of stories of family members being really split across the kind of border divide. So in a certain way, I feel like there's a bit more empathy for the kind of transnational conditions. But on the other hand, the kind of national discourse that we're seeing, the borders are closed, quarantines, did people have the right or wrong vaccines, and even the broader discourse about borders opening. In Australia, the national borders means for many people, that they'll be able to see family and do, have their holidays. That's a big thing. Are we going to be open by Christmas? That's the sort of, the big moment for many families in Australia. And you can sort of see it that, the more we go through Easter or other sorts of things, and we have those connections disrupted, that, it's really difficult. But then when you hear from a kind of Australian national perspective, what borders opening up means is that I can go on holiday, I can travel, that sort of thing. So it's always sort of still seen as, you know, about the kind of experience of of leaving Australia and the kind of exploring. So it doesn't, you know, there's kind of two different discourses. There's that, you know, this must be what it's like. And then, you know, but then at the same time, you've got this other kind of, you know, nationalist family international is about traveling, exploring the world, which, you know, as a migrant to Australia, sometimes, you know, often feels almost like a right, you know, like how in Europe in August, everyone travels. That's the sort of dynamic that is the sort of expectation here. So I think that those two dimensions are really kind of interesting. And I think the kind of situatedness within Australia around that. But then I think too, I mean, the one thing that probably isn't clear for those of you who don't know Australia is that the borders between states are also closed. So I actually can't go and visit Jelena because she's in another state. And those have been, it has been like that. And that's quite an extreme form of sort of border closures. And so that's where that kind of empathy with transnational migrants is sort of happening, but it feels like it might be quickly forgotten once we have movement there. So I don't know, Jillian, if you wanted to add anything as I guess a proper Australian.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks everyone for your reflections. Actually, Heather, you set up what I wanted to say very well, because I was listening to Yeoh and Valentina, and I just could not help but think, you know, a Melburnian in Australia, a Melburnian in Australia. And I think I keep coming back to how anthropologists have characterized Australia's national culture, and I think it's particularly relevant here. So I'm thinking here of Thomas Hyland Eriksson and Ghassan Haj and Bruce Kapferer, who have described Australia's national character as being defined by this contradictory, multi-layered discourse, which Kapferer describes as an ethos of egalitarian individualism, which emphasizes personal autonomy, self-reliance, and a pragmatic, practical approach to challenges and problems. And we see that come out in how tolerating and living with and making do with the weeks to months long lockdown have been, you know, sort of navigated. And then on the other hand, Thomas Eriksson picks up this discourse and argues that it's because of the history of colonial industrial modernity within Australia that's arrived at this present moment, where there's this tension between this ethos of self-reliance, but also this kind of informal, you know, making do way of life that masks and sort of structures the society according to class hierarchies and ethnic exclusion, which we are definitely seeing here. Once the Australian borders were closed to international, we ran out of borders to close. The borders between states started closing to close citizens from one state out to another. And I would just like to bring up, you know, the current circumstances where not only do Australians need to apply for permission to leave Australia, within states, you also need to apply for permission to move around the state, and that's within the state of Victoria. For example, from urban to rural, as well as crossing the border into New South Wales. So there's this constant structuring of exclusion, and it's interesting to reflect on this ethos of egalitarian individualism based on this structuring of exclusion within the context of Australia and how that's going to pan out through the pandemic and post-pandemic.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for coming, but also thank you as always to the events team at ARI, to Valerie, Minghua and Sharon, who have helped to set things up today. I'm sure if we were in Singapore, we'd be having now a lovely lunch or afternoon tea or dinner. Unfortunately, that can't be the case, but hopefully you can all get a chance to go and have something to eat and go and spend some time with the people you're located in and around. And I look forward to seeing you all online again very soon. So thank you very much, everyone.